First of all, let's look at the verb to be in past simple tense. It's a strong verb because it will not need an auxiliary to make negative and interrogative sentences, and the verb to be in past tense is was and were. We say I was, he was, she was, and it was. I, he, she, we say was, and we were, you were, and they were. We, you, they were. For the negative sentences, we say was not. We can also say wasn't, was not, and wasn't. It's exactly the same thing. And for were, we say were not, or we can also say weren't, were not, and weren't are also the same thing. If it's not the verb to be, it's not a strong verb. In past simple tense, we have regular verbs and irregular verbs. Regular verbs take ed at the end, and irregular verbs, well, you have to remember them by heart. There is a list of irregular verbs. And both regular and irregular verbs need an auxiliary in past simple tense, and this auxiliary is did. It's the same auxiliary for all the pronouns. I did, he did, she did, it did, we did, you did, and they did. So it's the same auxiliary for all pronouns, and it's the auxiliary did. The negative auxiliary is did not, or we can also say didn't. It's important to know that when the auxiliary is in the sentence, the verb is not conjugated. So, for example, if it's a regular verb, we will use the infinitive form. We will remove the ed and we will use the infinitive form. For example, if the verb in the past simple tense is invited, in the negative form, we would say didn't invite. We will use the infinitive form. And in the question, we will say did someone invite and add the complement and a question mark. Another example is the verb to help in past simple tense. It's helped, but in the negative form we would say didn't help. We will use the infinitive form, and in the question we will say did someone help. We will add the complement and put the question mark. If it's an irregular verb, we will also have to use the infinitive form of this verb, which might be different from the irregular verb. For example, the verb made in past simple tense, we would use the infinitive make, didn't make, and in the question we would say did someone make. We will add the complement and put the question mark. Another example of an irregular verb is went. The infinitive is go, so we would say didn't go, and in the question we would say did someone go. We will add the complement and the question mark. Let's take a look at another irregular verb, took. The infinitive is take, so the negative form would be didn't take, and the question would be did someone take. We will use the infinitive form. We will add the complement and the question mark. If there is a strong verb in the sentence, and the strong verb is the verb to be, so for example, we have the verb was in the sentence, we will not use an auxiliary. It will make the negative form itself, so we can say was not, something was not, add a complement and a period. We can also say wasn't, was not, and wasn't. It's exactly the same thing. For the question, our strong verb will go in the beginning of the sentence. Here we go. So our question will start with was something, then complement and a question mark. As we know, the verb to be in past simple tense can be was or were. So if we have the verb were in the sentence, the negative form will be were not, something were not, complement. And were not can be contracted to weren't. So were not and weren't is the same thing. For the question, the verb to be will go in the beginning of the sentence. So our question will start with were, subject, complement, and the question mark. That's our question. Were, subject, complement, and question mark. Now let's look at the examples. The first example is Mia was in the kitchen. We have the verb was, which is a superverb, and it will not need an auxiliary to make negative and interrogative sentences. So the negative sentence is going to be Mia was not in the kitchen. Mia was not in the kitchen. Or we can also say Mia wasn't in the kitchen. For the question, our strong verb will go in the beginning of the sentence, and the question will be, was Mia in the kitchen? Was Mia in the kitchen? And we will not forget the question mark. Let's look at another example. Mia baked a cake. In this case, baked is not a strong verb. It's a regular verb because it ends with ed. It will need an auxiliary did. The negative auxiliary will be didn't. And the infinitive form of the verb is bake, baked, bake. So now we're ready to make the negative sentence, and the negative sentence is going to be Mia didn't bake. We will use the infinitive form. The verb is not conjugated. Mia didn't bake a cake. Mia didn't bake a cake. For the question, we will also have to use the infinitive form. So we will say, did Mia, and then we will use the infinitive form. Is it baked? No, it's not baked. We have to remove the ed. We will use the infinitive form bake. So it's going to be, did Mia bake a cake? And we will not forget the question mark at the end. The next example is Mia wrote a letter. In this case, we have an irregular verb wrote. We will use the auxiliary did in past simple tense, and the negative auxiliary is didn't. When the auxiliary is in the sentence, we will use the infinitive form of the verb, which is write. And now we're ready to make our negative and interrogative sentence. The negative sentence is Mia didn't write. The infinitive form is write, so Mia didn't write a letter. That is our negative sentence. And for the question, we will start with the auxiliary did, and we will use the infinitive form of the verb. Did Mia write a letter? And we do not forget the question mark at the end of the question. Let's look at a few more examples. So Leah was at school. In this sentence, we have the strong verb was. It will not need an auxiliary. So the negative sentence is going to be Leah wasn't at school. And the question is, was Leah at school? And do not forget the question mark at the end. The next example is they were hungry. Were is a strong verb. It will not need an auxiliary. And the negative sentence will be they were not hungry, or you can also say they weren't hungry. And the question will be, were they hungry? Question mark. The next example is Zach saw a monster under his bed. Saw is an irregular verb. The infinitive form is see. So the negative sentence will be Zach didn't see a monster under his bed. The question is, did Zach see a monster under his bed? And the last example is Zoe opened the window. Here we have a regular verb opened. It ends with ed. The infinitive form is open. And the negative sentence is Zoe didn't open the window. The question will be, did Zoe open the window? And we do not forget the question mark.